welcome to the student faculty seminar of the President's Lecture Series at the Philosophy Forum. It's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce Linda Vilmes. She is a professor at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. She has crossed and recrossed the line between academics and politics more often and more successfully than anyone I know. And a little more light, the light of reason and rationality has fallen upon public policy and the budget process in particular. We're indebted to Professor Vilmes for that being so. You will get a full account of her accomplishments this evening at 8 o'clock when in the University Center ballroom she will talk about strengthening America by investing in public service. Her topic this afternoon is the cost of the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts and their impact on the economy. Please join me in welcoming Professor Vilmes.
Thank you very much for hosting me here in Missoula. It's a pleasure to be here. I've never been here. I've been to Montana, but I haven't been to Missoula before, so it really is a pleasure. The topic that I am going to talk to you about today is to give you a glimpse of the cost of the Iraq and Afghanistan conflict. And this is a subject that I have been working on for a number of years. I co-authored a book which is called The $3 Trillion War, The True Cost of the Iraq Conflict, that came out 2 years ago when the cost was $3 trillion, that I co-authored with Joe Stiglitz, who, as you know, is a Nobel laureate in economics. And what I'm going to take you through here in order to get into the economic costs are some of the issues around the scale of the war, how many people are involved, what is so expensive about it, and then we can talk a little bit about what happens in an economy when you spend this much money on a war. So I want this to be very interactive. I have a lot of material because I've been working on this for years and I've written a book and many papers and many book chapters on it. I could talk about it till the cows come home. So, please feel free to jump in if there's something you don't understand. I see we have a wide range of people here from different vantage points, different perspectives. See, there's a lady here from Cardiff. So, please, if there's something that is not clear, jump in and ask me, and I'll try and take you through as much of this as time permits. I probably won't stand too much behind the lectern because I'm already standing up. So I'm short enough you'll be able to see the slides anyway. But we're going to talk about three things today. First, I want to talk to you about the scale of the conflicts. Secondly, about one of the very important issues, which is the implications of how we chose to pay for the war. There are two decisions when you go to war. One decision is whether or not to go to war. Another decision is how do you pay for the war once you've decided to go. And one of the main contributors to the cost of the war has been the way that we've chosen to finance the war. And third, to look at some of the economic consequences and costs. Before we start, I want to try and put in perspective some of our observations about the war that will come up in different ways. I want to say, first of all, that when I wrote the book, I was opposed to the war from the outset. However, the purpose of the book was really not as an anti-war book so much as a reckoning of what the war cost. Just in the same way that if somebody offers you a car and they say this car is going to have these benefits and it's going to cost you $15,000, you might make a different decision than if that same car was going to cost you $200,000. It's valuable just knowing what the cost is, and then you can decide whether the benefits are worth it. One of the issues regarding the Iraq War is that for a variety of reasons, there was very poor information about the cost. And the administration at the time very much underestimated the scale of the conflict, the dimensions of the conflict, the cost of the conflict, and the duration. In addition to that, there were a number of choices that were made along the way that are what I call sort of penny-wise, pound-foolish decisions. Decisions where we made choices because we expected the war to be short that had the effect of greatly increasing the long-term costs, most particularly regarding the weapons and the vehicles that we provided our troops with. Thirdly, the war, as with large expenditures in the U.S. government in general, suffers from the fact that the accounting system that the federal government uses is very, very inaccurate and poor. And 20 years ago, the government passed something called the Chief Financial Officers Act, the CFO Act, which was supposed to improve accounting in the government. And since then, most government agencies have made some progress toward understanding better where money goes. But the Pentagon has flunked its audit every year for the 20 years that this has been going on. They have never been able to figure out where money goes. And this accounting problem, which is unrelated to the war, but which makes accounting for the war very difficult, has exacerbated the problems and has led almost inevitably to some of the war profiteering and problems with contractors and Halliburton and so on that we are so familiar with. And finally, and I think you will see this very clearly in what I'm going to show you, that we still don't know what the full cost of the war will be, and we won't know for decades, really. And indeed, my current research is looking at how wars affect economies, and we're looking at wars over the past 200 years, because war costs go on for a long, long time, and we only see sort of the tip of the iceberg. So to start off with, if you can remember back to 2002, sort of before the decision was made to go into Iraq, those, not surprisingly, who were most gung-ho to go in were also the ones who were most enthusiastic about the prospects for victory and who most underestimated the cost of the war. And in particular, then Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld and then Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Mitch Daniels, projected that the war would cost between 50 and 60 billion. And the Deputy Defense Secretary at the time, Paul Wolfowitz, even went so far as to say that the war would pay for itself. Now, he said the war would pay for itself because, and this is going back to the point I just made, he was thinking about the first Gulf War in 1991, which in the sort of conventional wisdom is a war that paid for itself, because basically the Kuwaitis and the Saudis paid a lot of the upfront combat costs of that conflict. But even though that conflict lasted for only 5 weeks, and even though there were only a handful of US troops who were killed and a pretty small number who were wounded, we still pay $4.5 billion a year now in disability compensation for the first Gulf War. That's how these war costs go on long into the future. Now, at the time, the National Economic Council chief, Larry Lindsey, the chief economist, who had the job in the Bush administration that Larry Summers occupies in the Obama administration, he said that the war would cost 1 to 2% of GDP, which he estimated about 100 to 200 billion. And there were some academics, in particular the very respected economist Bill Nordhaus of Yale, who some of you may know because he's one of the leading environmental economists in the country, predicted that if the war went badly, the cost could go up to $2 trillion. But really nobody paid any attention to them. And the only result of this was that Larry Lindsey was fired. And he later wrote, 5 years later, that in a very interesting article in Fortune magazine, that he thought that the administration had really lost credibility because of the fact that it had suppressed the debate, the discussion, and had been completely unwilling to contemplate the prospect that the war might go badly. Now, one of the reasons that all of this was such an important discussion was because the Iraq War, and to some extent the war in Afghanistan, were wars of choice in that we could choose the timing and preparations and scale of the conflict. You know, in the case of Afghanistan, we were, of course, attacked in 9/11. So it could be argued that we had little choice about whether or not to go into Afghanistan, but we had a lot of choice over the timing and how we did it. And of course, in the case of Iraq, this was a war where the premise of the war was in order to preempt the possibility that Iraq might acquire weapons of mass destruction, and therefore there was a lot of scope for us to think in advance about how did we want to do it, how much would it cost, how could we finance it, what would happen if it didn't go according to plan, what would happen, and so forth. But in fact, due to the sort of enthusiasm of those at the top during the first Bush administration, that really didn't happen. Now, where we are up to is that the Iraq conflict is one of the longest wars the U.S. has fought. We have now been there for 7 years, which is much longer than we were in World War I or II or Korea, and is, you know, starting to approach the level of the Vietnam conflict. And it's also one of our most expensive wars. The only war that cost more was Second World War. But when you think about the Second World War, it was a massive mobilization of the country. 16 million Americans directly involved in the armed forces. And in real terms, adjusted for inflation, at a cost of about $3 trillion. Possibly, quite probably, the Iraq War has already exceeded the cost of the World War II, but we haven't calculated that exactly at this point. When you think about what is sort of driving that cost, one of the striking features is in real terms how much more it costs to put a troop into the field than it did in World War II. World War II, the cost per troop was $50,000. And in Iraq, the cost is about $750,000 per troop today, and $1 million per troop, you know, in Afghanistan, because Afghanistan is actually harder to get into, harder to supply, and so forth. Yes? This is the annual cost. The scale of the conflict so far, and this is a conflict which has been borne, many of these costs, as we'll see, have been borne by a very small percentage of the American population, unlike World War II, where both the financial cost and the overall cost were borne by a large section of the population. Over 2 million troops have been deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan in more than 3 million tours of duty. More than 40% have served 2 or more tours of duty, and about 15% have served 3 or more tours of duty. About 28% of those who have served been reservists and National Guards, and a very high percentage of parents of young children. And this is very different than Vietnam, for example, where the average age of a troop was 19. Very, very few parents. And so one of the whole dynamics of the current war has been the fact that you have somewhat older troops going into combat, coming back with a very high level of disabilities, mental health problems, and so forth, and going back and being reintegrated into a family situation. There have been 1.1 million veterans discharged to date. Of those, about half, more than 500,000, have been treated at veterans' medical facilities already. More than a third, it's between a third and a half, for mental health conditions, including post-traumatic stress disorder, some with or without traumatic brain injury, substance abuse, depression, and other problems. Almost that number have filed for disability compensation. And if you look at the disability claims individually, the average number of disabling conditions on a claim is 6, which means that the typical person coming back from combat is filing, has got 6 individual things wrong with them. A loss of hearing, as well as the fact that their back has been thrown out, as well as a systemic rash, as well as, other problems. So you're looking at people who are coming back with a large range of problems. And here is a very important slide showing the sort of tip of the iceberg of that large 500,000 group that I said had been treated in VA medical facilities. Most people are pretty familiar. OIF is Operation Iraqi Freedom. OEF is Operation Enduring Freedom, which is Afghanistan. The two things together are referred to in the military as the GWAT, the Global War on Terror. And in all military databases, that is how they are referred to. One of the very important sort of drivers of the cost of the war is the large number of troops who have been wounded. And as you can see, the number who have been wounded in direct hostile fire is 36,906. But that is the number that you typically see in the media, but that's actually a very misleading number. The number that should be used is the additional 47,890 who are troops who have been injured seriously enough to require medevacing from the theater. And these are people who have been, for example, in transportation accidents to and from the front. And one of the problems in the way that the administration during the first Bush administration, and I say first Bush because there was a change really in the second Bush administration with a lot of people, including Secretary Gates, who came in having to sort of pick up the mess, is that this second group was never reported anywhere. And we got this information almost accidentally because we work with a lot of veterans groups who filed Freedom of Information Act inquiries and discovered that one of the reasons the Veterans Department kept running out of money was because this group didn't really appear anywhere on the list. And at the time, the Pentagon was having a very difficult time recruiting. Some would say that it was deliberately suppressed. Whether or not it was deliberately suppressed, the issue is that if you compare that number of non-hostile woundings compared with the number you would expect to see during peacetime, so you just look at the marginal number of non-hostile woundings, it is 5 times higher. And that is because a lot of U.S. combat operations are done at night, you have a lot of people driving around at night, and because the Pentagon adopted an extremely narrow definition of hostile combat wounding. So if you have a convoy traveling of 5 vehicles and the vehicle in the front is hit by an explosive device and you are injured, you're technically injured in combat and you show up on the wounded hostile list. If you're in the second vehicle and you hit the first one, you hit a friendly vehicle, you don't show up there, you show up in the second list. So if you don't include this list, if you're killed, you show up in the dead list, whether you're in vehicle 1 or 2. But if you're wounded and you're in the second vehicle, you don't show up on the list. So when we look at the total number of casualties, this is a very high number. And in previous wars, the number of wounded, just looking at that hostile wounding, the ratio of wounded to deaths in hostile was about 2 to 1. So there was about 2 people wounded for every 1 who was killed. But thanks mostly to the amazing advances in medical medicine, you can see that here is like 6 to 1. And if you take the larger number, you can see it's like 15 to 1. So you have a very, very different kind of profile in terms of the number of people who are wounded. And this drives a lot of the cost of the war because these are people who have earned and who are entitled to a lifetime of disability compensation, of veterans' medical benefits, and other type of expensive long-term benefits. I'm going to go through with you some of this. I can't go through all of it. There are 2 kinds of costs when we're looking at the war. One are the budgetary costs, which is the cost to the taxpayer, to federal government. You know, the money that we're spending at the moment to keep people there, the veterans' costs I was just talking about, the cost of replacing all the military equipment that we used up, Defense Department money, which, and one of the problems here has been that there's been a lot of commingling of funds between regular defense appropriations, which have gone up by $1 trillion separately during this period, and war-related equipment. And then economic costs. And economic costs really are 2 kinds. There are microeconomic costs, which are the costs of, that are borne by people but not by the government. So, for example, for all of those people who are wounded that I was just talking about, in 20% of cases, there's somebody at home, a spouse or a parent who has to stop working in order to become a full-time caretaker. Now that is a cost, but it's not a cost the government pays. It's an economic, microeconomic cost. There are also the economic loss to the economy of losing so many young people in their prime. And then there are macroeconomic costs, which have had a very direct contributing effect on the economy, and as I will talk to you about in a minute, have been one of the contributing factors to the economic crisis. When we think about, first of all, the budgetary costs, the sort of upfront money, what you read about in the newspapers, typically is that we've spent about $1 trillion for Iraq and Afghanistan to date in upfront costs. And this is very, very much the tip of the iceberg cost. This is how much we've already spent for, you know, security and for military operations and so forth. Now, importantly, that doesn't include things like military salaries for full-time active troops, because we're paying those anyway. It does include, however, the fact that because we had a lot of reservists and National Guards who were fighting in the war, those individuals would typically be, we would be paying them like for 1 weekend a month, and instead we are paying the difference. So we've counted in our costs how much is the difference between what we were paying and the mobilization costs. And if you think about it sort of in monthly average cost, we are now spending about $16 billion per month. Now, $16 billion per month, it's hard to even fathom how much this is, but I was sitting at lunch with a group of your faculty today, and they asked me, we're talking about the national parks, because I serve on the National Park Commission. And the national parks total budget for all the parks, you know, including, you know, Yellowstone and Yosemite and Glacier and the, you know, battlefields like Gettysburg and places like Ellis Island, the Statue of Liberty, for all of them together is $2.5 billion a year. So it's less than what we spend in Iraq and Afghanistan in 1 week. And one of the issues here is for us to sort of think about whether we as the public, as taxpayers, you know, have a good accounting for how much this is costing us in order for it to be one of the factors in deciding these 2 questions I said about, 1, should we be there, and 2, if so, how should we pay for it? Our cost projection from our book of $3 trillion was roughly in line with the other projections that have been done. The Joint Economic Committee of the Congress put it at $3.5 trillion. The Congressional Budget Office, which looked at the budgetary but not the economic costs, put it between 1.8 and 2.3 trillion. All of these were done, about 2 years ago, around the same time. So everyone, when they look at it, sees that there are not only those costs that we've already spent, but all of these accrued liabilities. We know that we have to pay to replace all the helicopters, to replace the 42,000 light vehicles, to buy all the MRAP vehicles, to pay all the veterans benefits, et cetera. So when you add up the promissory notes, as it were, in addition to the upfront costs, you get this kind of number. And that's before you start thinking about how much money we have to pay in interest on all the money that we borrowed, which we see in our national debt, to pay for the war. I think some of this I just talked about, but these veterans costs are very, extensive cost. As I mentioned, we pay for over $4 billion a year for Gulf War veterans. We pay $26 billion a year for Vietnam veterans. These costs go on for a long time, and if you look at the peak year for paying veterans compensation, for World War I veterans, the year in which we paid out the most for World War I was 1969. This is 50 years after the armistice, more than 50 years. For World War II, I can't remember which is which. One of those is for the European operations and one was for Pacific, but was in the 80s. Vietnam is still growing, and and this is still growing. And as I just mentioned, this is essentially driven by the large number of folks who are eligible to receive disability compensation. And in terms of our projections, we had projected, and this was in our highest possible scenario, that medical claims, for example, would reach about 600,000 by 2017 and then level off. And we had projected that by where we are now in 2010, that they would be at about 400,000, but they're already, where the red star is, over 500,000. So and in the disability compensation area, it's even more, because we had projected that about 28% of veterans would have filed by now, and it's already over 40%. So it seems like the costs are going, we won't know until it's over, but it seems that the costs are accelerating faster than we had projected. The second thing that I want to talk about is how many decisions made during the war really made the war a lot more expensive. And despite the fact that it was clear pretty early on that the war was not going well, there was this, in some ways, inspiring and enduring confidence on the part of the president and others that we were constantly just around the corner. And you can see a few of the quotes I put down here, that in November 2003 that we reached a turning point, and in 2004 that we reached a turning point, and in 2005 that we were in a turning point, and in May of 2005, we were in the last throes. And then, as you recall, in March 2006, and in the summer of 2006 was the time when Iraq was in virtually a civil war. And the issue here is that if you believe that you're in a turning point right here, you might decide not to make a lot of investment in a lot more body armor and a lot more really expensive weapon systems that protect your troops, because you think that you're going to be out very soon. And this is what happened here. And this happened really in a number of different ways. One of the ways was in terms of the decisions about who we were going to use to fight the war. And the decision was made to essentially use extended deployments of our existing force, which has had very severe consequences for them in terms of the epidemic of post-traumatic stress disorder and so forth. And many, many, many studies. I work with a team of physicians at the University of California, San Francisco. Many, many studies have showed the relationship between the number of firefights that a troop is exposed to and the amount of mental health problems that they have. But to extend the tours of duty of our troops, to reduce the dwell times, that's the time before, in between deployments of our troops, to essentially max out the reservists and the National Guards, to rely to an absolutely unprecedented extent on contractors deeply embedded in every aspect of the operation, from repairing vehicles to interrogating prisoners at Abu Ghraib, leading to the whole fiasco we're familiar with. And also, in terms of deciding that we would pay for the whole thing sort of on the national credit card, that we would not do war taxes, which is the way President Reagan had paid for the buildup during the Cold War, or the way that Johnson had paid for the Vietnam War, but we would pay for the whole thing out of debt. And so instead of, at this point, you will recall that in 2003, the president, just as the war was getting into full swing, cut taxes again for a second massive round of spending cuts at the same time that all of this spending was going into effect. So you had these decisions, which, as I'll show you, in many ways sort of exacerbated how much the war was costing. Now, I talked to you about just a couple of these things. The reliance on contractors is a very interesting issue. There are right now in Iraq over 100,000 contractors. So contractors outnumber active duty troops. Now, contractors are an interesting sort of mechanism for deciding how to fight a war and how to pay for it. Because on the one hand, contractors are not entitled to long-term disability compensation, to long-term veterans benefits. On the other hand, the cost per contractor depends very much on how you award the contracts. And in this case, the vast majority of the contracts were awarded on a sole source, no bid kind of a basis. So you had a huge volume, hundreds of billions of dollars that have been awarded in contracts so far with really minimum scrutiny. And every organization that's looked at this, whether it's the Congressional Research Service, the Congressional Budget Office, the GAO, the Pentagon's Inspector General, the numerous defense audit agencies, the Special Inspector General for Reconstruction, which has just looked at the reconstruction element of this, which is about $40 billion out of this whole thing, has found enormous errors and omissions. Or to use Pentagon speak, they've found about $35 billion on which they have lost visibility. So a second area in which these sort of decisions, but the decision was just throw more at it, more contractors, more people, more reservists, because we're right around the corner. Probably the most truly distressing sort of penny-wise, pound-foolish decision was regarding the Humvee, the situation with the Humvees and the so-called MRAP, mine-resistant vehicles. The regular Humvees, we have any military troops in the room here? Yeah, has anybody ridden in one of these? Yes, you want to describe for us what it's like in a Humvee versus an MRAP? The plain old Humvee, which is so susceptible to an IED.
It would be pretty much just like any given car. You can run around in a very thin, small vehicle. The upper armored Humvees are a lot heavier, which are also very susceptible to rollovers because they are so heavy. creates problems in itself. But the light, or the Humvee originally was just a all-terrain vehicle, very similar to a Jeep. You can take the doors off very easily. So if you think of just your regular Jeep Wrangler, that's what I would say. The best way to look at it. And they take that, they supercharge the motor, which is a diesel motor, and then they add another 15,000 pounds to it. So it's a really heavy vehicle now that is not as agile as it used to be, and a little more power just to get it around, so we burn up more fuel there.
Thank you. That's a great description. So the decision was the vast majority of deaths and severe injuries in Iraq and Afghanistan have been caused by improvised explosive devices, very much related to people driving around in these Humvees, which, as your classmate just described, kind of are like this on the bottom. And in 2004, the Marines had prototype tested another type of vehicle that basically had a V-shaped hull. It looked like that. And there was a choice. These things cost $1 million each. But the second choice was to sort of up-armor these things, which was basically to put this additional layer on them, which cost about $100,000 each. And the result of doing this instead of doing this was that, first of all, if you have an explosive device and you're driving in it, anywhere this hits, you're going to be blown up. If the explosive device hits there, unless it hits at exactly the right inflection point, you will not be. And so the Marines found, in the documents that we read, which, as I say, are heartbreaking, because they were senior officials in the Marines in 2004 begging for the money to go for the V-shaped MRAP vehicles in order to save lives. And a decision was made, but these were too expensive, and that they should go for the less costly option. And in between this thing in 2004 and 2007, when Secretary Gates came in, and in his second week he reversed this decision and ordered this entire fleet of 80,000 Humvees to be replaced by this. But at that time, there was only one company in the country that made them, and it took forever to get them in. So in the meanwhile, 2,000 people had been killed, the vast majority, about 85%, in improvised explosive devices. And those who were driving in these vehicles found them more cumbersome, harder to maneuver. So this was not only a sort of distressing decision from a human level, but it also turns out to be a really stupid decision, because we're going to be spending the money, to take care of the thousands of injuries for the next 50 years. Let me turn now to show you some economic costs. How are we doing time-wise? We okay? Okay. So one of the questions that people used to ask us all the time, certainly 2 years ago when the book came out, was how could it be that we were spending all this money, $16 billion a month and so forth, and that nothing happened in the economy? How could it happen? How could we sort of have this war for free? And the answer really, which we wrote about, but despite writing together with a Nobel laureate, no one paid attention, was that really the economy was weakening, and oil prices in particular, with the key to this, were increasing very, very much. Oil prices went from $23 a barrel in March 2003 when we invaded Iraq. Can you remember $23 a barrel? To $140 a barrel 4 years later. And basically, in order to, this enormous run-up in oil prices was driven by many factors, not only the Iraq War. It was certainly just one piece of this story. But one of the things that happened with Iraq was that, in addition to Iraqi oil being taken off the supply table, the instability in the Middle East caused a lot of refining capacity not to be developed, not to come online when it was scheduled, a lot of investments to be withheld. So where in 2003, the futures markets anticipated that supply and demand would keep steady, that the supply would grow in order to meet the growing demand from China and India and so forth, what happened is that the supply did not increase. The supply decreased relative to demand. So this kind of shift created this, it was one of the factors that led to this enormous price increase. This, of course, the enormous increase in oil put a lot of pressure on consumers, took a lot of money out of the hands of people, and gave it to the oil-producing nations. In order to deal with this situation, the Federal Reserve injected a huge amount of liquidity, low interest rates, into the country. This was one of the things that contributed to the housing bubble. You know the rest of the story. Not just to sort of say, I told you so, but you can read this, but this is, what we had written in early 2008. To say this, that the Federal Reserve had, pumped in liquidity, at the same time that we were growing these enormous debts. And as we had said at that time, that there was no way to disentangle the economy and the war. So let's look a little bit at some of these economic costs. And then I'll sort of come back and try and bring it all together. One of the issues in terms of sort of understanding how all this happened is that the way the war was financed was that it was financed through what's called emergency supplemental appropriations. Now, typically the way money gets spent in Washington is that you submit every year, every department has its budget. So if you're the national parks, you go and you say, here's how much money I need for Glacier Park and whatever park. And, there's a lot of discussion about it. And the budget people in both parties look at it and so forth, and they kind of, bump the tires, and they eventually get a budget. Now, that's the way all money is supposed to be spent, except there is one provision for something called emergency supplemental money, which is supposed to be for, like, emergencies, like Hurricane Katrina, for example, that you could not have anticipated it the year before. And the need to get money is so great that you say, forget about all these people looking at it. We just want to get the money there fast because it's, a national emergency, a crisis, or whatever. Now, the entire Iraq and Afghanistan wars, all of the $1 trillion that have been spent so far have been financed using this emergency vehicle. And arguably, you can say that initially, the first time we invaded Afghanistan and Iraq, it was a surprise because we didn't know it a year before. But it's very difficult to justify, 9 years into the war, that we are still funding it this way. Now, what that has enabled the country to do is that we have sort of our regular budget, which goes through every year, and then there's this extra thing, which is the supplemental emergency appropriation. And since we don't have any money for it, it's all paid for out of debt. And so this added an enormous amount of debt during the years of the war, because we were paying, of course, as we all know, not just the money we borrowed, but we're paying interest on the money that we borrowed, and we're paying, and we're borrowing more to cover that interest in addition to the money that we're borrowing to wage the war. The second couple of things I want to talk to you about the accounting situation and then sort of how this debt financing worked. I think I just talked about this, but I would point out that this problem of this use of emergency supplementals has been a very much a sort of, bipartisan, if you will, like accounting conspiracy. It has suited everybody because no one has had to tackle the fact that we're spending beyond our means. So it has been, it has, apart from among people like myself and David Walker, who was at the GAO, and some watchdog agencies, financial watchdogs, really it has just kind of suited everybody to put the whole thing on the credit card. And it's interesting because this is the first war since the Revolutionary War that the U.S. has fought this way. And during the Revolutionary War, the colonies borrowed money from France to finance the Revolutionary War. But since then, all subsequent presidents have actually done various things. Oops, I lost it, but different kinds of things in, essentially saying we have a war going on. This is so important that we have got to do things to pay for it. And they have all, Reagan, Johnson, Roosevelt, Truman, others have all, done that to one extent or another. The second issue which has sort of enabled this to happen is this very poor accounting system that I was talking to you about. And we have any accounting students here? Anyone know the difference between cash and accrual accounting? Okay. Well, cash accounting is just like what we're spending like this year on something. And no business larger than a corner grocery store is allowed to use cash accounting. Accrual accounting takes into account what you are paying now and what you still owe. But the federal government uses cash accounting, which means that the future costs are hidden. And if you did accrual accounting, it would require that future liabilities, whether those are liabilities for Medicare or liabilities for veterans or liabilities for equipment that we have depreciated, would show up. And if you look at any business balance sheet, you'll see that there are conventions in accounting for reporting accrued liabilities. But because of the fact that this is endemic to many things in the government, and in fact it explains many problems beyond this, but particularly in wars where you have so many costs that are far in the future, the use of cash accounting allows us to really not come to grips with the long-term accrued liabilities from what we're spending now. A related problem is the fact that we actually commingle, if you will, Defense Department spending and war spending. So in trying to understand how much the war costs, for example, there is no way to know exactly what Iraq costs. What you have to do is figure out where in the thousands of different lines in the budget that talk about helicopters, how many helicopter replacement blades are being used for helicopters that are being used up in Iraq, and how much faster are helicopter blades being used up in Iraq than they would be if they were being used in peacetime. It is an incredibly laborious process. Having said that, two economists from outside the government, considering we have thousands of economists and statisticians in the government, shouldn't really be having to do this. It is possible to do it, but the accounting makes it very difficult. And it is hard to separate out what is regular defense and what is war spending. But over the past, since 2003, the defense budget, the non-war related defense budget, has gone up by about $1 trillion. And what has happened within that is that there has been a lot of sort of pernicious effects, because some of the things that the military wanted have been funded through war funding, which have nothing to do with the war, going through, again, as I said, this emergency supplemental process, which means they don't get much scrutiny. There are a lot of cost overruns, contractor overruns, etc. Meanwhile, there have been things in the defense budget which are related to the war, which really should have been attributed to war costs. For example, enormous increase in the cost of military medicine. But not enough. Not enough, for example, to take care of the troops at Walter Reed Medical Center, who were found rotting with, rats 2 years ago. I mean, and the inability to understand where this money is between regular defense appropriations and war appropriations has made it very, very difficult to really figure this out. And again, you know, all of the people who kind of look at this stuff have criticized it. Despite all of this spending, we have essentially a military force right now in which we're spending more and kind of getting less than ever before. You know, we have, our Air Force has fewer hours of training than it ever has in its history. Our Air Force fleet is the oldest, as planes it has ever been. So the system, you know, as it stands now, has sort of conspired against our own interest in many, many ways. When we borrow money, as we all understand, money has to be repaid with debt and interest. The money that is, when we looked at the cost of the war, there are two ways you can count it. You can count it with all the money that's being spent on the budget plus the interest, or you can count it with the money being spent plus economic costs, like the cost to the economy, the cost to people who are taking care of a loved one. But we didn't add those two up because there's an element of double counting. So if you tried to add those things up, you would end up at 6-7 trillion. But looking at it either way, just on a budgetary way or just on an economic way, either way, you immediately, under the most conservative assumptions, come to 3 trillion, which is why we called the book The $3 Trillion War. I think you're very familiar with this fact, but the war debt, which of course accrues much more rapidly because you're paying interest and borrowing money to pay off the interest and so on, the war debt, combined with the tax cuts at the same time, you know, rose from 5.7 trillion to 10.6 trillion during the Bush presidency. You can see it there at the end, and you know, and created a situation in which, when the economy did turn down, and then we were, you know, it's a different conversation. I'm talking more about it tonight, but you know, we were doing the stimulus and the bailout and all that, which we already had this enormous debt, so that we are now, we were at 70% of GDP, we're now at 90% of GDP, and with, at a time when the economy was growing, we should have been paying down debt rather than accruing more debt. And I'm not going to talk about that right. We're at 90%, yes. And although, you know, arguably, I mean, you know, we're at 90 now. I mean, that doesn't really capture the severity of the situation, because the most job-intensive spending that happens is at the state and local level, and state and local governments are like Greece. You know, they can't control currency, they can't control interest rates, they have borrowed against their pension funds. Every dollar that we have put in at the federal level has been canceled out by cuts at the local level. So actually, even looking at the 90% debt doesn't really capture the full difficulty that we're in at the moment, of which the war is only one part, but it is a part and it needs to be recognized as a part. When we think about macroeconomic costs, as I mentioned, you know, there are two kinds. There are the sort of cost to society. There are costs on the economy. There are many, many different kinds of microeconomic costs. And just to give you a few of them, you know, we have a couple of chapters on this in the book. For example, just looking at number 6, for example, because of the fact that we used and sort of maxed out, as I put it, you know, our reservists and our guards in Iraq and Afghanistan, we had to bear the cost of the fact that we as a society did not have first responders when things go wrong at home. And this was particularly dramatically clear during the Katrina fiasco. When the hurricane hit, there were 7,000 Louisiana National Guardsmen in Iraq. And, when, I have interviewed many of these people, and many of them said, that the reason they joined the Guards was because they wanted to be there helping their community when a disaster did strike. And actually, they were in Iraq. So you have the sort of social cost borne by the fact that we had to find some other way to backfill people to do the job, and they probably were people who were not as well equipped. You see this over and over again, this kind of loss to first responder capability as being a cost. I mean, other costs are, for example, the economic value of a life. Economists quantify the economic value of a life, which is kind of crass and cold unless you consider the alternative, which is to not think about the economic value of a life at all. If the Environmental Protection Agency or the Food and Drug Administration figures out like how many people will die if they approve a drug, they figure that the cost of a life of a prime age male, as they put it, is about $7 million. The amount that we pay in compensation, this is about $100,000 in compensation and in death insurance to a family if they lose a U.S. soldier, is $500,000. So there's a very big difference between what is the sort of, even the government's agencies sort of reckoning of the value of a life versus what we actually pay out in cash. So to really kind of count up the economic loss to the society of 6,000 prime age young people, it is a more accurate reflection to multiply that money, that number of lost lives by the 7 million, than it is by the 500,000. The macroeconomic price impact of oil prices, something that I just talked to you about, a little bit. I think that the difficulty of sort of following this logic is that it's one of these connect the dots thing. It's always very difficult, especially for journalists writing in the mass media, to provide explanations which have to connect a lot of dots. But the dots are that the oil prices rose, that this reduced incomes in the US and other industrial countries, which led to weaker demand overall. In other words, people weren't buying as much stuff, which meant that the Fed lowered interest rates to stimulate us to buy more stuff. The low interest rates led us to buy more houses. This conspired with a totally separate issue, which is the failure to regulate the mortgage industry and the loans and the 100% interest-only loans and so forth. But all of this contributed to the housing bubble. And in our accounting, we only counted a very small percentage in our costing. We counted between $5 and $10 of the oil price increase as a directly attributable to the war, even though the price increase was very, very big. And we actually didn't count as a cost, although, as my co-author always reminds me, we should have, the loss in tax revenue from the weaker aggregate demand from the fact that oil prices had gone up. The sort of further complexity here is that not only did the budgetary and the economic costs kind of turn in on themselves, because the US is the largest purchaser of oil in the world, the largest single purchaser. And as you just heard from your classmate, what we were doing was adding, very, very fuel-intensive vehicles at a very rapid rate. And so when you look at Afghanistan, for example, 25% of the cost, the $1 million a year per troop cost, is fuel. So we have a situation where we were actually in Iraq paying world oil prices for very heavy vehicles, whereas the Iraqis themselves were paying, 10% of what we were paying for fuel. And this was actually our fuel purchases in the region were actually contributing to the rise in oil prices, which is contributing to the economic chaos in the rest of the world. And I will just conclude and then open for questions. There's so much here to talk about. I've only given you a very, very small snapshot of trying to find your way through this maze. The one thing that we do know in looking back at our estimates from a couple of years ago is that the costs are actually going to be much higher than we had anticipated. In terms of the budgetary costs, the disability claims are higher than we thought, the medical claims are higher than we thought, the depreciation, the replacement, the military reset cost for equipment, weaponry, and so forth is much higher than we thought. The incidence of traumatic brain injuries, of post-traumatic stress disorder, and other issues epidemic is not my word. Epidemic is used in every Institute of Medicine and National Academy of Science and medical study. I mean, it's now cliche to say that. And we probably will be in Iraq for, a significant period of time, because even though we will be withdrawing our combat troops next year, if all goes on schedule, we're likely to have at least 50,000, so-called non-combat troops stationed in Kuwait indefinitely. Now, Afghanistan is in many ways a byproduct. The cost of Afghanistan can be in many ways attributed to the way that the war in Iraq was conducted, because one of the consequences of being diverted in Iraq was that we neglected Afghanistan. And this is not just my opinion, but looking at the hundreds and hundreds of requests from those who were field commanders and generals serving in Afghanistan, asking for more resources, more troops, more this, more that, more attention. From 2003 to 2007, we were spending much less in Afghanistan than we were in 2002. So we kind of let it drift, and during that time, of course, the Taliban regrouped, they strengthened, and now we have the resurgence in Afghanistan. And this is a very, very expensive battle to combat. The cost of troops, as I mentioned, is about 25% higher just because of the difficulty of the supply routes, the number of things that have to be helicoptered in and so forth. But we've also made many, many commitments to Afghanistan beyond our troops. I mean, for example, right now, the Taliban pays its soldiers twice as much as the Afghani army pays its troops. Now, we have undertaken to change that, but Afghanistan is the fourth poorest country in the world. They don't have any money, so we're going to pay the Afghani troops and to train the Afghani troops. There are 70,000 Afghani troops. Now we've pledged to create another 100,000 Afghani troops, to pay them more, to train 100,000 Afghani police forces. This is a $10 billion a year commitment, which Hamid Karzai, the Afghani president, has said he has said, I don't know if this is true, but he said that the U.S. has privately promised that we will pay for this for at least the next 15 years. And when you consider that they have no money in Afghanistan, it seems likely that, that we have committed to a very, very long-term, significant cost. And, finally, when we were talking about the $3 trillion war, we didn't attribute any of the costs of the Great Recession of 2008, which the war helped precipitate. We didn't think about that at all. We didn't know when it would strike. But if you were really looking at the full costs and the full impact, you would need to attribute at least some portion of what has happened to our country to the decisions that were made in Iraq. And with that, I will open it up to questions. Yes?
You just made your statement about finally, we didn't even consider. I was hoping that you might say, or at least indicate, that there is a concern in the academic community about the costs, not only to the United States and its people, but the cost to the Iraqi people and their society. How, I see it's very difficult to get the American people even concerned about these shattering facts that you presented. But how do we get them interested in what has happened to the country of Iraq and to the people, which is even more devastating in many ways? What is the problem with our country now that we seem to have developed a moral apathy to what is happening, not only here but in the rest of the world?
Well, I think it's a very good question about the cost to Iraq. And we do have a chapter in the book about cost to other countries, cost to Britain, the cost to our allies, cost to the world, cost to Iraq. If you're thinking about, for example, understanding the cost to Iraq, you need a different methodology than the methodology we followed to understand the cost to the U.S. But one of the significant costs to Iraq, for example, is the fact that of the 2.5 million people who left Iraq during the height of the sectarian violence and moved mostly to Syria, 95% of them have not come back. And they are, when you look at who they are the spine of society. They are the doctors, the lawyers, the architects, the accountants, the dentists. They are the middle class that builds a society, the university professors. The teachers, the nurses, they are gone from Iraq, and they do not seem, at this point, we don't know what's going to happen in Iraq in the end, but we do know that this large chunk of the population has left. Now, Iraq has 31 million people, so to lose 2.5 million people who are the productive middle class is an enormous loss to the society. And the verdict is still out as to whether at the end of this the society will be reconstructed or not. Yes, lady in the black vest. Yeah.
Well, today on Alternative Radio, which is on at 105 on KUFM from its own of Boulder, Colorado, and they had Martin Luther King's 1976 April 4th talk, and it was called Beyond Vietnam. And he said the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And I think this is what Mike is trying to say, that we can't get Americans, moving on this. Poor Bill Moyers every Friday night waiting for somebody to just do something. And that's what Mike and I need. So it's your freedom that we can't mobilize people against this horrible war.
Well, I think, every one of us kind of looks in ourselves and says, what can I do? I felt in trying to think about this exact issue that the thing that I could do was that I could lay out the true cost. That could be my thing that I could do. And I think that all of us who feel that there is something wrong with the way this is unfolding, needs to find, our individual ways to, to contribute. But I do think that understanding, as I was saying at the very beginning about the cost of a car, understanding the cost of the war, understanding the impact on the economy, understanding the trade-offs between spending money on this versus not spending money on Glacier Park or whatever other priorities we have. That is part of the education, which the government doesn't do for us. So we need to think about that as one of the ways to think about it. Yes.
I find it fascinating that economists, when they try to quantify the socio-political decisions that we make, your contribution is obviously meant to look at the cost of it. And you obviously didn't look at the cost of not doing something like this, right? I mean, it would be almost impossible to quantify what ifs, right? I mean, you can't look at those and say, what if there was really yellow cake that ended up in Canada afterwards? And what if there were, what if our economy was destroyed by these people? And I'm just curious if you did any of that. And then the other thing I know I have a whole question. The other thing I was curious about was when you try to quantify these things, do you take a look at what happens when we lose our AAA bond rating? Did you guys look at that at all?
Okay, well, I think to answer your first question first, the understanding the counterfactual, as we call it, what would have happened had we not done this, is very, very hard. It's certainly very, very hard to understand the counterfactual. However, you can identify some things, which we did, in terms of what were we doing before we went into Iraq. Now, before March 2003, we were not doing nothing. We were actually flying 30,000 sorties a year over the Iraq southern and northern no-fly zones at a cost of about $12 billion a year. So, which needs to be subtracted as we did. There were things that we were actually doing, so it's not that there was nothing happening. In fact, we now know that flying the no-fly zones and enforcing that as rigorously as we did actually had worked, in that it had prevented reconstruction of weapons of mass destruction, and that turned out to be an extremely cost-effective way to achieve the aims we wanted to. I think the counterfactual on the other side of, had you spent, by this point, trillions of dollars on investing in education or infrastructure or scientific research or natural resources or conservation or development of the impoverished people in the Middle East, or any of a whole set of things, we do know that probably almost any of those things would have, in terms of the economy, had a better multiplier for the economy. I mean, investing in things in the United States, like infrastructure and education, have a multiplier in that they grow the economy over the long term, whereas a lot of the money that we've spent here has had a very low multiplier. And if you spend, a lot of money on a Sri Lankan contractor who's cooking meals at a forward operating base in Afghanistan, I mean, that has no multiplier for the United States. It has very, very low multiplier. Your second question, in terms of the bond rating, I think the bond rating is kind of a red herring. Japan lost its bond rating and never had any trouble having access to the capital markets or anything. I mean, I think that the real...
It goes to overhead though, right? I mean, essentially, this is all an overhead calculation in a way. I mean, when you talk about the cost, getting at the cost accounting, you're mentioning the accounting methods. And I was immediately thinking about activity-based cost accounting as something that would help in a situation like this, because it's mainly an overhead calculation. You're assigning a great deal of overhead to each unit.
Well, the words activity-based cost accounting are like sweet music to my ears. But they don't mean much to most people. But I mean, the basic concept of sort of understanding where money goes, which is what any company can do, is something that the government actually doesn't do very well. So we barely know that we have 25 programs that protect the Pacific salmon. We definitely don't know how much of that money do we spend vetting contracts, or letting or supervising procurement officials, or working in various kinds of overheads related to fish. I mean, we have no accounting system to capture that information. So I mean, I agree with you, but that's a bigger issue than this. I really think that as regards the economy and jobs at the moment, the biggest issue is the issue at the state and local level. That's the issue that if we do not fix it, is going to tip us back into recession. Yes.
If I recall correctly, at one point, wasn't Wolfowitz suggesting that some of this activity over there could be paid for by production of oil that would be sold, that we would somehow participate in that?
He was. I mean, Wolfowitz was an enormously enthusiastic supporter of this, and not surprisingly, he was probably the person in the first administration who most underestimated the cost and underestimated the likelihood, of a long-scale duration. And at the time, I mean, you had many people, including General Shinseki and Colin Powell and others, who were saying this is going to require a huge number of troops, it's going to take a long time. If we do this, we have to be prepared to stay there because it's going to turn into a big sectarian problem, and blah, blah, blah. You had the Army War College saying this, you had, academics, you had, but it was disregarded in the kind of, rush in. And as I mentioned before, Wolfowitz's hope that oil revenues would eventually sort of pay for the whole thing was really hearkening back to his erroneous calculation of the first Gulf War, in which we did have oil revenues and contributions from allies that paid for those initial combat costs, but we don't have any help in paying for the huge long-term costs, which are just going to grow a lot bigger now that there is the Gulf War syndrome has now become a presumptive condition, and there's going to be an enormously, surge in disability payments around the first Gulf War. So I mean, it was a fundamentally flawed analysis that he did. But
Probably see the irony in Shinseki running the VA.
Well, I mean, I know Shinseki very well. I mean, I have enormous respect for him. I think to come out of a military environment to say something unpopular because he thought it was true. It is another one of those decisions that if we had followed it, we would have planned better for the war up front. Probably it would have been waged more effectively, and probably the long-term costs would have been shorter. Yes.
So you're talking about how the war hurt the macroeconomy. Aside from the oil prices, the slight increase in oil prices due to the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, and then the deflator, or the multiplier, loss of the multiplier. Was there anything else involved in that? And if so, how much money of the total spent would not be counted in government GDP, in the government budget?
I think you can identify at least 4 ways in which the war affected the macroeconomy. One being the oil prices, 2 being that related to the oil prices, aggregate demand was reduced and so tax revenues were lower. 3 being the low multiplier compared to any other kind of investment you could imagine. And 4th being the additional burden on the debt through the financing of the war through debt. So, I mean, I would say those are the 4 main ways that the war really affected the macroeconomy. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and then the other part was just like what portion of how much $1 trillion we're going to say here was actually, because a lot of it's spent in the United States in terms of, on weapons and such. So how much of that was actually gone overseas and we didn't see any of, or it didn't have any effect on our economy in a positive sense?
There were a small number of beneficiaries, you know, from the war in terms of companies that made money, you know, through weapon systems and whatever, but very, very small. And you know, actually, when you sort of run the calculations of sort of, you know, the employment effects and multiplier effects of that compared to any other kind of basket of multipliers you could find, you know, it's unfavorable. There is another discussion you could have about over the long term, since an awful lot of the, as it were, the benefit, you know, of the war hasn't happened yet either, because, you know, most of the equipment that has, you know, hasn't been replaced yet. The orders haven't been placed yet. I mean, we know when we leave Iraq we're going to abandon 50,000 vehicles there, but no one's come out and said it yet. Okay, they haven't been written off anywhere yet. And so then someone's going to have to replace them. You know, so that calculus has not been, you know, has not sort of been done yet.
Thank you. Question.